Sometimes the heart waits a lifetime to find its home. At 53, wealthy rancher Harlan Creed thought his chance for love had passed him by like tumbleweeds in an autumn wind. Then came the blizzard of 1889, when he spotted two young women stumbling through the snow, near death from cold. He saved them without thinking twice. That's just who Harlan was. But when morning came, the twins told him about their mother, an older woman trapped in a buried wagon miles away. Harlan rode back through the frozen wilderness and found her, gray-haired, gentle-eyed Edaline, wrapped in quilts and quiet dignity. What started as a rescue became something neither expected. Two souls who had lived through loss discovered that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not in youth, but in the wisdom of weathered hearts. What happens when love arrives at the perfect time, even if that time comes later in life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Creed Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, where the Bitterroot Mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the winter sky. Harlan Creed sat in his leather chair beside the stone fireplace, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee, watching the snow begin to fall outside his cabin window. At 53, he'd built an empire from nothing. 3,000 head of prime beef cattle, the finest horses in the territory, and enough gold in the Butte City Bank to buy half the state if he'd a mind to. Yet for all his success, the cabin felt as empty as a tomb. His worn leather journal lay open on the oak table beside him, filled with neat columns of numbers tracking cattle births, feed costs, and market prices. Between the business entries, scattered like rare wildflowers among rocks, were brief personal notes written in his careful hand. Saw a family of deer by the creek today. Reminded me of something I can't quite name. Or cookie made apple pie. Tastes like loneliness. He'd never meant for anyone to read those lines. They just spilled out sometimes when the silence grew too heavy. The journal had been his companion for 20 years, since the day his marriage to Catherine fell apart like a house built on sand. She'd been a beauty from back east, all silk dresses and refined manners, but Montana winters had worn her down to brittle discontent. "This place is killing me, Harlan," she'd said on that final morning, her bags already packed. "I need civilization, not this endless emptiness." He'd offered to take her to San Francisco, maybe even back to Boston, but she'd shaken her head. "It's not the place, it's you. You love this land more than you could ever love a person." Maybe she'd been right. After she left, Harlan had thrown himself into building the ranch with the fervor of a man possessed. Every fence, post driven into the frozen ground, every barn raised against the mountain wind, every deal struck in the territorial capital had been another brick in the wall between him and the ache of solitude. His neighbors respected him, his ranch hands were loyal as hounds, and visiting cattlemen spoke his name with reverence. But respect wasn't the same as warmth, and reverence couldn't fill a man's bed on cold nights. The kitchen door banged open, letting in a swirl of snow in the bulky form of Cookie Patterson, his cook and oldest friend. Cookie had been with him since the early days, when they'd both been young men full of dreams and bluster. Now Cookie's beard was white as the snow on his boots, and his belly strained against his worn leather vest. "Storm's coming in hard, boss," Cookie said, stomping his feet on the mat. "Jake and the boys are bringing the horses into the barn. This one's got the smell of a real blizzard about it." Harlan nodded, closing his journal with a soft thud. "Temperature dropping fast?" "Like a stone down a well. Winds picking up from the north, too. Could be we're looking at 3-4 days of this." Cookie poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, his movements economical from long practice. "You want me to send word to the Hendersons? Mary's been poorly. They might need supplies." It was typical of Cookie to think of their neighbors first. The Hendersons ran a smaller spread 10 miles south, and Mary Henderson had been fighting a persistent cough all winter. In this country, Neighbors looked after neighbors. It wasn't charity. It was survival. Good thinking. Have Jake ride over before the worst of it hits. Take them some of that soup you made and tell them they're welcome to shelter here if things get bad. Cookie grinned, his weathered face creasing like old leather. You're a good man, Harlan Creed, even if you do your best to hide it. Before Harlan could respond, the sound of hoofbeats approached the cabin at a gallop. Through the window he could see Jake Morrison, his foreman, riding hard through the thickening snow. The young man's face was grim as he dismounted and hurried to the door. "Boss, we got trouble brewing," Jake announced as he stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat. Spotted smoke rising from the direction of Widow's Pass. Looked like a campfire or maybe a wagon in distress. With this storm coming in, how far out? Harlan was already reaching for his heavy coat. Maybe 2 hours hard riding in good weather. In this snow could be 3 or 4, and it's getting worse by the minute. Harlan studied the young man's face. Jake Morrison had been with the ranch for 5 years, ever since his own father died and left him orphaned at 18. He had good instincts and better eyes. If he said he'd seen smoke, there was smoke. Could be travelers caught out in the storm, Cookie observed, pouring Jake a cup of coffee. This time of year, folks still trying to make it, west before winter sets in proper. The thought of people, possibly a family, trapped in the wilderness during a Montana blizzard made Harlan's chest tight. He'd seen what winter could do to the unprepared. The mountains were littered with the bones of those who'd underestimated the fury of a high-plains storm. "Jake, get my horse saddled. Pack extra blankets, rope, and whatever medical supplies Cookie can spare." Harlan was already pulling on his boots, his mind shifting into the focused calm that had served him well in 100 emergencies. "You're not going out in this alone," Cookie protested. "Take some of the boys with you. In a blizzard like this, more men just means more people to keep track of. I'll move faster alone." Harlan wrapped his gun belt around his waist and checked his pistol out of long habit. The wilderness held dangers beyond weather. Wolves, bears, and occasionally men with ill intentions. Jake returned from the barn, leading Harlan's big sorrel gelding, Thunder. The horse was 17 hands of solid muscle and intelligence, bred for the mountains and trained to trust his rider's judgment, even when that judgment seemed questionable. Thunder's thick winter coat was already dusted with snow, his breath steaming in the frigid air. "You sure about this, boss?" Jake asked as Harlan swung into the saddle. "Storm's only going to get worse." Harlan settled his hat firmly on his head and pulled his coat collar up against the wind. "If it were your family out there, what would you want someone to do?" The question hung in the air between them, answered by the howling wind. Jake nodded slowly and stepped back, understanding. "Keep the home fires burning," Harlan called over the storm's voice. "If I'm not back by morning, don't come looking till this blows over." He touched his spurs to Thunder's flanks, and they headed out into the white wall of the approaching blizzard. Behind him, the warm lights of his cabin windows grew small and distant, swallowed by the storm. Ahead lay only wilderness, wind, and whatever fate awaited in the frozen darkness. As Thunder's hooves found their rhythm on the snow-covered trail, Harlan reflected on the strange turns life could take. This morning, he'd been just another wealthy rancher, sitting by his fire and counting his blessings. Now he was riding into one of the worst storms he'd seen in years, chasing smoke and possibility through the mountains. At his age, most men would have stayed by the fire and left the heroics to younger backs. But something deep in his chest, maybe it was conscience, maybe it was the need to feel useful beyond ledger books and cattle counts, drove him forward into the storm. The wind cut through his coat like a blade, and snow stung his face beneath the brim of his hat. But Thunder moved steadily onward, trusting his rider's purpose, even when the destination remained unclear. In his saddlebags, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was the leather journal that had become his closest confidant over the years. Tonight, perhaps, It would record something more significant than cattle prices and weather observations. Tonight, perhaps, it would mark the beginning of a story he couldn't yet imagine. The blizzard struck with the fury of an avenging angel, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of white. Snow fell so thick that Harlan could barely see Thunder's ears, and the wind howled like banshees through the mountain passes. What had started as heavy flakes now pelted down in sheets, driven horizontal by gusts that threatened to tear a man from his saddle. Thunder's steady gait never faltered, his large hooves finding purchase on the treacherous ground through instinct born of mountain breeding. Ice crystals formed on the gelding's whiskers, and steam rose from his powerful body despite the brutal cold. Harlan leaned forward in the saddle, trusting his horse's superior senses as his own, became nearly useless in the white maelstrom. They'd been riding for 2 hours when Harlan spotted the first sign, a splash of dark blue against the snow, moving erratically about 50 yards ahead. He squinted through the storm, wiping ice from his eyelashes, and his heart lurched. 2 figures stumbled through the drifts, their movements growing weaker with each step. Even from a distance, he could see they were in desperate straits. "Ha, Thunder!" he called to his horse, touching spurs to the animal's flanks. The sorrel responded immediately, lunging forward through the snow toward the struggling figures. As they drew closer, Harlan's fears were confirmed. 2 young women, probably twins from their similar build and matching blue shawls, were fighting their way through snow that reached past their knees. Their faces were pale as winter moonlight, their lips blue with cold, and their movements had the jerky, uncoordinated quality that spoke of approaching collapse from exposure. "Hold on," Harlan shouted over the storm's roar, but his words were snatched away by the wind. He brought Thunder alongside the nearest woman and saw her look up at him with eyes glazed by cold and desperation. She was perhaps 25, with honey-colored hair plastered to her head by melting snow, and she clutched her sister's arm with mittened hands. Without hesitation, Harlan dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but these women had been walking in it for who knew how long. He pulled the heavy wool blankets from his saddlebags and wrapped them around both women's shoulders. "Can you hear me?" he asked the nearest twin, his voice raised against the wind. Her eyes focused on him with difficulty, and she nodded weakly. "Our wagon," she managed through chattering teeth. "Mama, we left Mama." "Where?" Harlan demanded, but even as he asked, he could see the woman was near collapse. There would be time for explanations later. Right now, getting them to shelter was the only thing that mattered. Working quickly, he lifted the first woman onto Thunder's back, then helped her sister climb up behind her. The sturdy gelding stood rock-steady despite the wind and the unfamiliar burden, his training and temperament proving their worth. Harlan swung up behind them both, his arms encircling the women to keep them in the saddle. "Hold tight," he called to them. "We're going home." The ride back to his cabin seemed to take forever. Thunder moved more carefully now, carrying his triple burden through snow that continued to deepen with each passing minute. The women leaned against each other and against Harlan, their bodies gradually warming under the shared blankets and the heat of the horse beneath them. One of them mumbled something about their mother, but her words were lost in the storm's fury. When the warm lights of the Creed ranch finally appeared through the snow like a beacon of salvation, Harlan felt a relief so profound it surprised him. Cookie and Jake rushed out to help, their faces grim with concern as they saw the burden Thunder carried. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Cookie breathed, reaching up to help the women down from the horse. "Look at the state of them. Get them inside, quick now." They carried the women into the warm cabin, where Cookie immediately began bustling around the kitchen, heating water and gathering dry clothes. Harlan helped settle them in chairs by the fire, piling additional blankets around their shoulders and rubbing their hands to restore circulation. "What are your names?" he asked gently, as color began to return to their cheeks. "Sarah," whispered the woman he'd first spotted in the storm. "This is my sister Ruth. We're We're most grateful to you, sir. The name's Harlan Creed. This is my ranch." He studied their faces, seeing the family resemblance clearly now that they were out of the storm. "You mentioned your mother. Where is she?" Ruth, who seemed slightly stronger than her sister, looked up at him with eyes full of worry and guilt. "We left her in the wagon. It was stuck fast in a drift about 5 miles back toward Widow's Pass. She's not strong like us, and we thought if we could find help." Her voice broke, and Sarah took up the story. "Mama made us go. Said she'd only slow us down, and if we could find someone, anyone, maybe they could come back with horses or a bigger wagon to pull her free." Harlan felt ice settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the storm outside. An elderly woman, alone in a wagon, in weather like this. Even with shelter, she wouldn't last long in the cold. He glanced toward the window, where the blizzard showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be growing worse. "How long ago did you leave her?" he asked. "Hours," Sarah admitted, her voice small with shame. "We got lost in the storm. We've been wandering. We don't even know which direction the wagon is from here." Cookie appeared, with hot soup and dry clothes. "You girls get out of those wet things and into something warm," he said with gruff kindness. "Sarah, was it? And Ruth? Those are fine names. My own dear mother was named Sarah." As the twins moved toward the back room to change clothes, Harlan caught Cookie's arm. "There's another one," he said quietly. "Their mother, stuck in a wagon somewhere near Widow's Pass. Alone." Cookie's weathered face went pale. "In this storm? Harlan, you can't be thinking—" "I have to." Harlan was already reaching for his coat again. "I know that country like my own backyard. If there's a chance, even a small one." "It's suicide," Jake protested, stepping forward. "The storm's only getting worse, and full dark is coming on. You'll never find her in this, and you'll freeze to death trying." Harlan paused, his hand on his coat. Everything Jake said was true. The rational thing to do would be to wait for the storm to pass, then organize a proper search party. But by then, it would likely be too late. An elderly woman, alone in the wilderness during a Montana blizzard, she had hours at most, maybe less. When the twins emerged from the back room wearing Cookie's spare clothes, Harlan knelt beside Sarah's chair. "I need you to tell me everything you can remember about where you left your mother. Every detail might matter." Sarah's eyes widened as she understood his intention. "You're going back for her? In this storm?" "If there's a way to find her, I will." He kept his voice calm and reassuring, though his mind was already racing through the challenges ahead. "What's your mother's name?" "Edaline," Ruth said softly. "Edaline March. She's all we have left in the world." The simple honesty of those words hit Harlan like a physical blow. He thought of his own comfortable solitude, his chosen isolation, and felt something shift in his chest. These women had crossed half a continent together, facing dangers and hardships he could only imagine. Now their small family was scattered by the storm, and their anchor, their mother, lay somewhere in the frozen wilderness, probably convinced she would never see her daughters again. "Tell me about the wagon," he said. "What did it look like? What was around it when you left?" For the next few minutes he listened intently as the twins described their last sight of their mother, wrapped in quilts in the wagon bed, waving them on with determined courage even as tears froze on her cheeks. They painted a picture of the surrounding area, a grove of stunted pines, a distinctive rock formation, the remains of an old campfire. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough. Harlan had ridden every mile of this country for 20 years. If Edaline March was alive, he would find her. "Keep them warm," he told Cookie as he headed for the door. "I'll be back." "With their mother," Sarah called after him, her voice carrying desperate hope. Harlan paused at the threshold, meeting her eyes, across the warm room. "With their mother," he promised. The storm had reached its full fury by the time Harlan rode out again into the white darkness. Thunder moved like a ghost through the swirling snow, his hooves finding uncertain purchase on ground that shifted and changed with each gust of wind. Harlan had tied a rope around his waist, the other end secured to his saddle horn. If he fell or became separated from his horse, it might mean the difference between life and death. Finding the wagon in these conditions seemed impossible, but Harlan had learned to read the land the way other men read books. Even buried under snow, the geography held clues for those who knew how to see them. The twins had mentioned a grove of stunted pines and a rock formation that sounded like Devil's Thumb, a landmark he'd known since boyhood. If their wagon had gotten stuck near Widow's Pass, there were only so many places it could be. The cold was brutal, seeping through his heavy coat and leather gloves to settle in his bones. Ice formed on Thunder's mane and on the brim of Harlan's hat, and each breath felt like swallowing knives. But the thought of an elderly woman, Edaline, the twins had called her, alone and probably terrified in this frozen wasteland, drove him forward through the storm. After what felt like hours, but was probably closer to one, Thunder's ears pricked forward, and the horse changed direction slightly without any command from Harlan. The gelding had caught some scent or sound that human senses couldn't detect. Trusting his mount's instincts, Harlan gave Thunder his head and let the horse pick his way through a stand of wind-twisted pines. There, in a small depression sheltered by the trees, sat a prairie schooner nearly buried in snow. The canvas top sagged under the weight of accumulated ice, and one wheel was buried completely in a drift that had formed against the leeward side. It looked abandoned, forsaken by God and man alike. Harlan dismounted and fought his way through the snow to the wagon's tailgate. His heart hammered as he called out, "Mrs. March? Edaline? Can you hear me?" For a moment, there was only the wind's howl. Then, faint as a prayer, came a voice from within the wagon. "Who's there?" Relief flooded through Harlan so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. "Name's Harlan Creed, ma'am. Your daughters sent me to find you." A rustling sound came from inside the wagon, followed by the scrape of wood on wood. The tailgate opened a crack, and Harlan found himself looking into the most extraordinary eyes he'd ever seen. They were gray as storm clouds but warm as summer rain, set in a face that spoke of strength tempered by gentleness. Edaline March was perhaps 45, with silver threads running through hair the color of wheat at harvest. She was wrapped in a quilt that had seen better days, but her dignity remained intact despite her desperate circumstances. "Sarah and Ruth?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the cold. "They're safe." "Safe and warm in my cabin, ma'am. Worried sick about you, but safe." Harlan had to shout over the wind, but he kept his tone as reassuring as possible. "We need to get you out of here. Can you travel?" Edaline's assessment was swift and practical. "I can travel. My legs work fine. It's just this wagon that's stuck fast." She gathered her quilts around her and prepared to climb out into the storm. "I wasn't sure anyone would come. The girls have been gone so long." Harlan helped her down from the wagon, struck by her composure despite the circumstances. Many people would have been hysterical with fear and cold, but Edaline March faced the situation with quiet courage that reminded him of the mountain women he'd known, tough as rawhide but gentle as spring rain. "Do you have anything you need to take?" he asked, eyeing the wagon's contents. Edaline's hand went to a small wooden box nestled among her belongings. "My recipes," she said simply. "They're all I have left of home." The box was weather-beaten and worn smooth by countless handlings, obviously precious beyond its humble appearance. Harlan secured the recipe box in his saddlebags, then helped Edaline onto Thunder's back. The horse stood patient as stone despite the wind and the strange new passenger. As Harlan swung up behind her, he was surprised by how naturally she settled against him, trusting his strength to see them safely home. "Hold tight, Mrs. March. Thunder's as sure-footed as they come, but this storm's not giving any quarter." The ride back was a test of endurance and faith. Thunder moved carefully but steadily through the white maze, his sense of direction proving true even when landmarks disappeared in the swirling snow. Edaline said little during the journey, but Harlan could feel the quiet strength in her slight frame as she endured the punishing cold without complaint. When the lights of the ranch house appeared through the storm, Edaline straightened in the saddle. "That's your home?" "Yes, ma'am, and yours, for as long as you need it." The reunion between mother and daughters brought tears to Cookie's eyes, though he'd never admit it. The twins rushed to embrace Edaline the moment Harlan helped her down from Thunder, and for a long moment the three women held each other in the circle of lamplight spilling from the cabin door. "Mama, we're so sorry," Sarah sobbed. "We should never have left you." "Nonsense," Edaline said firmly, though her own voice was thick with emotion. "You did exactly what I told you to do. And look," she gestured toward Harlan, who was leading Thunder toward the barn. "You found us an angel in the storm." Inside the warm cabin, as Edaline thawed her hands by the fire and accepted Cookie's hot soup with gracious thanks, Harlan found himself studying her with new eyes. She wasn't what he'd expected when the twins spoke of their mother. There was no frailty here, no helpless dependency. Instead, he saw a woman who had faced the wilderness with courage and emerged with her spirit intact. "Mr. Creed," Edaline said, looking up from her soup, "I can never repay what you've done tonight. You risked your life for a stranger." "Any decent man would have done the same," Harlan replied, feeling heat creep up his neck under her steady gaze. "No," she said quietly. "Any decent man would have waited for the storm to pass and come looking for my body in the morning. What you did tonight was extraordinary." The simple honesty in her words, spoken without dramatic flourish or excessive gratitude, touched something deep in Harlan's chest. He excused himself to see to Thunder's care, needing a moment in the cold air to steady himself. As he brushed down his faithful horse and made sure the animal had warm feed and fresh water, Harlan found his thoughts returning again and again to those gray eyes and the quiet strength behind them. When he returned to the cabin, he found the three women settled by the fire, Edaline examining her rescued recipe box while her daughters told her about their harrowing trek through the storm. The scene was so natural, so complete, that for a moment Harlan felt like an intruder in his own home. But when Edaline looked up and smiled at him, a real smile that reached her remarkable eyes, he realized something had changed in his carefully ordered world. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years suddenly felt like a choice rather than a sentence. Outside, the storm continued to rage, trapping them all together in the warm circle of light and safety that was his cabin. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Harlan Creed found himself grateful for a blizzard. The storm raged for 3 days, and in that time, Harlan's cabin transformed from a bachelor's austere refuge into something approaching a home. It wasn't just the presence of 3 women that made the difference, though their voices and gentle laughter certainly warmed the rooms in ways a fire never could. It was the small touches that Edaline brought to his daily existence. A cloth smoothed over his rough table, wildflowers dried and arranged in a simple jar, the lingering scent of her cooking that made even his familiar kitchen smell like a place where a family might gather. Edaline had produced a small sewing kit from her belongings, and Harlan watched with fascination as she worked her quilting needles with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, creating beauty from scraps of fabric that seemed worthless until her skill transformed them into something precious. She was mending a tear in Sarah's dress, but her hands worked with the care of an artist, each stitch perfectly placed. "You have quite a skill with that needle," Harlan observed, settling into the chair across from her with his evening coffee. Edaline smiled without looking up from her work. "My mother taught me when I was barely tall enough to reach her sewing basket. She always said a woman who could work with her hands would never want for purpose, no matter where life took her." Her voice carried the warmth of cherished memory. I've found that to be true more often than not. The twins were playing a quiet game of cards at the kitchen table, their voices a soft murmur that added to the cabin's new sense of contentment. Outside, the wind continued to howl around the eaves, but inside, the storm felt distant and harmless. "Tell me about your travels," Harlan said. "What brought you so far west in the middle of winter?" Edaline's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. "We've been traveling for the better part of 2 years," she said carefully. "After my husband passed, there wasn't much left for us in Kansas. The girls had heard there were opportunities in Oregon. Good land, new beginnings. It seemed like the right time to start fresh." Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story, but Harlan didn't press. Every family had their private sorrows, and he respected her right to share only what felt comfortable. Instead, he found himself telling her about his own journey to Montana, how he'd arrived 25 years ago with nothing but a horse, a gun, and the kind of desperate determination that came from having nowhere else to go. "It must have been lonely," Edaline said softly, "building all this by yourself. I had Cookie from early on, and Jake's been like family for years. But yes," Harlan paused, surprised by his own honesty. "Yes, it was lonely. Still is, most of the time." Their eyes met across the space between their chairs, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Here were two people who had learned to live with solitude, to find strength in their own company, but who recognized the particular quality of loneliness that came from having no one to share life's small moments with. "Ruth," Edaline called to her daughter, breaking the spell. "Would you put the kettle on for tea? And Sarah, see if Mr. Creed has any honey for sweetening." The domestic routine that followed felt as natural as breathing. Sarah found the honey while Ruth prepared the tea, and soon they were all gathered around Harlan's table, sharing stories and gentle conversation. Edaline asked thoughtful questions about ranch life, and Harlan found himself describing his work with more enthusiasm than he'd felt in years. "The spring roundup is something to see," he told them. "Hundreds of cattle scattered across miles of range, and we bring them all in for branding and counting. Takes weeks, and every man on the crew earns his pay twice over." "It sounds like quite an undertaking," Edaline said. "You must need a large crew." 8 men year-round, a dozen more for roundup and drives. They're good men, loyal and hard-working, though I suspect they'd benefit from having decent food for a change. He shot a teasing look at Cookie, who was dozing by the fire. "I heard that," Cookie grumbled without opening his eyes. "My cooking's kept this outfit alive for 20 years, and I don't see anyone starving." The laughter that followed was warm and easy, and Harlan realized he couldn't remember the last time his home had hosted such simple, comfortable joy. As the evening wore on and the twins began to yawn, Edaline gracefully organized the sleeping arrangements. She insisted that Harlan keep his own bed while she and the girls made do with blankets by the fire. "Nonsense," Harlan protested. "You ladies take the bedroom. I've slept on harder ground than this floor more times than I can count." But Edaline was quietly immovable when she'd made up her mind. "A guest doesn't put her host out of his own bed, Mr. Creed. We're perfectly comfortable here by the warmth." As the cabin settled into nighttime quiet, Harlan lay in his bed listening to the soft sounds of the women preparing for sleep. He could hear Edaline's gentle voice as she said goodnight to her daughters, could hear the rustle of blankets being arranged. The sounds of family life, he realized. Sounds that his home had never known. For the first time since Catherine left, Harlan allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to have such companionship as a permanent part of his life. Not the desperate longing he'd felt in his younger years, but something deeper and more settled. The quiet contentment of shared days and peaceful evenings, of someone to talk with over morning coffee and someone to wish good night when darkness fell. But even as the thought formed, he pushed it away. Edaline March and her daughters were travelers, seeking a new life in Oregon. In a few days, the storm would pass, and they would continue their journey west. To think otherwise was to set himself up for disappointment, and at 53, he'd learned better than to build castles on foundations of wishful thinking. Still, as he drifted toward sleep with the sound of the wind outside and the gentle breathing of his unexpected guests nearby, Harlan found himself hoping that the storm might last just a little longer. Tomorrow would bring decisions and departures soon enough. Tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, his home felt truly inhabited. On the fourth morning, Harlan woke to silence. The wind had finally stilled, and pale sunlight streamed through his cabin windows, illuminating a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached halfway up the barn walls, and the familiar landscape had been sculpted into strange new shapes by the storm's fury. But it was over, and that meant decisions could no longer be postponed. Edaline was already up, standing by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in her hands. She'd braided her graying hair back in a simple style that somehow made her look both practical and elegant. When she heard his footsteps, she turned with a smile that seemed to carry a touch of sadness. "It's beautiful," she said, nodding toward the snow-covered vista. Like a new world waiting to be discovered. Harlan joined her at the window, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her clothes. "Beautiful, but dangerous. That snow's deep enough to swallow a horse, and there'll be ice under it from the freeze." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding that the storm's end marked the beginning of something else, the need to make plans, to decide what came next. Edaline was the first to speak what they were both thinking. "I suppose we should talk about moving on," she said quietly. "We've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Before Harlan could respond, the sound of approaching horses caught his attention. Through the window, he could see Jake leading a small party of riders toward the cabin, Cookie on his old mare, and behind them Sheriff Tom Bradley from Bitter Creek, along with two men Harlan didn't recognize. "Looks like we have visitors," he said, reaching for his coat. "Stay inside until I see what this is about." He stepped onto the porch just as the riders reached the cabin. Sheriff Bradley was a good man, honest and fair, but his presence usually meant some kind of trouble. The two strangers wore the hard-used clothes of men who lived rough, and both carried guns with a casual familiarity that spoke of regular use. "Morning, Harlan," Bradley called as he dismounted. "Heard you might have some folks here who came through the storm. These men are looking for a family, woman and two daughters, traveling in a covered wagon." One of the strangers, a lean man with cold eyes and a silver-streaked beard, stepped forward. "Name's Garrett," he said. "These folks we're tracking. They took something that doesn't belong to them. We aim to get it back." Harlan felt ice settle in his stomach, but he kept his voice level. "What kind of something?" "Family matter," the other stranger said. He was younger, with the kind of restless energy that made Harlan's hand drift instinctively toward his gun. "Private business, you might say. But we've been following their trail for weeks, and it leads right to this area." Jake caught Harlan's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. A warning. These men had the smell of trouble about them, the kind that followed decent people who were running from something they couldn't fight. "Well," Harlan said carefully, "the storm was pretty fierce. Could be anyone caught in it is still digging out, or maybe didn't make it through at all. Hard to say." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "You haven't seen them, then? Woman about 45, two daughters in their 20s. They'd be traveling light, probably scared." The description fit Edaline and the twins perfectly, and Harlan found himself wondering what these men really wanted. Their story about something being taken didn't ring true. Both strangers had the look of men who took things themselves rather than legitimate owners seeking return of property. "Like I said, the storm was bad. I've been focused on keeping my own folks safe." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Something about these men set every instinct he'd developed in 25 years of frontier living on edge. Sheriff Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Harlan, If you have seen these folks, you should know there's some question about their legal status. Might be they're wanted for questioning back east." "What kind of questioning?" Harlan asked, though he suspected he knew the answer wouldn't be honest. The younger stranger spoke up. "Like Garrett said, it's family business. The woman's late husband left some debts, and there are folks who need to collect on them. Nothing these ladies can't clear up with a conversation." Everything about the man's tone suggested that any such conversation would end badly for Edaline and her daughters. Harlan had met enough dangerous men to recognize the type, the kind who used legal-sounding words to justify actions that had nothing to do with law or justice. From inside the cabin came the soft sound of footsteps, and Harlan knew Edaline was listening at the door. He hoped she had the sense to keep herself and the twins hidden until these men moved on. "Well," he said again, "I'll keep an eye out. If I do see anyone matching that description, where should I send word?" Garrett smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be around the area for a few more days. Staying at the hotel in Bitter Creek. But don't wait too long to get in touch. We're not patient men, and this business needs settling." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. These weren't lawmen seeking justice. They were predators hunting prey. After they rode away, Sheriff Bradley lingered for a moment. "Harlan, I don't like this," he said quietly. "Those men aren't telling the whole truth about their business here. If you do know anything about the family they're seeking, be careful who you trust. I appreciate the warning, Tom. There's something else you should know. I found this tacked to a tree about a mile from your north pasture." Bradley pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to Harlan. It was a wanted poster, yellowed and weather-stained, bearing the image of a man with kind eyes and a familiar jawline. The name printed below the picture made Harlan's blood run cold. "Thomas March, wanted for armed robbery. Reward $500 dead or alive." The face in the poster shared unmistakable features with Sarah and Ruth. This was their father, Edaline's late husband, and if men like Garrett were still hunting his family 2 years after his death, it meant whatever Thomas March had been involved in was far from finished. Harlan folded the poster carefully and tucked it into his coat. "Thanks for letting me know, Tom." After the sheriff rode away, Harlan stood on his porch for a long moment, studying his familiar ranch with new eyes. The peaceful morning had been shattered by the arrival of dangerous men with dangerous intentions. Inside his cabin waited a woman and her daughters who had apparently been running from such men for years. The smart thing would be to help them on their way quickly, before those strangers came back with more questions and less patience. But as he thought of Edaline's quiet strength and the trust in her daughter's eyes, Harlan realized he was long past doing the smart thing. When he stepped back inside, Edaline was waiting by the door, her face pale but composed. "They're looking for us," she said simply. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Harlan replied, pulling out his father's old pocket watch and checking the time. The gold timepiece had belonged to 3 generations of Creed men, but until this moment it had felt like nothing more than a useful tool. Now, with Edaline standing before him and danger closing in, the watch seemed to represent something more, the weight of family legacy and the choices that defined a man's character. "We should leave," Edaline said quietly. "We've brought enough trouble to your door already." Harlan snapped the watch closed and met her eyes. "Not yet. We need to talk." The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows as Harlan spread the wanted poster on his kitchen table. Sarah and Ruth sat close together on one side, their faces pale with shock and something that might have been shame. Edaline sat across from them, her hands folded in her lap with the same quiet composure she'd shown throughout every crisis, but Harlan could see the pain in her eyes. "I never wanted you girls to know," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Your father, Thomas, he wasn't the man I thought I married. By the time I learned the truth, it was too late. Sarah reached across the table to cover her mother's hands with her own. "Mama, you don't need to explain anything to us. Papa loved us, whatever else he might have done." "Did he?" Edaline's voice carried years of doubt and self-recrimination. Or did he love the danger, the excitement of living outside the law? I used to tell myself that he did what he did for us, to provide for his family. But the truth is, I think Thomas March loved being an outlaw more than he ever loved being a husband and father. Harlan studied the poster again, noting the date, 3 years old, but the reward was substantial enough to keep bounty hunters interested long after most men would have given up the chase. What happened to him? How did he die? Edaline was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He was shot trying to rob a bank in Topeka. The sheriff there said he died protecting his partners, gave them time to escape while he held off the law. Even at the end, he chose them over us. The bitterness in her voice was like a knife twisted in an old wound. Harlan began to understand the particular quality of loneliness he'd sensed in her, not the simple solitude of widowhood, but the deeper isolation of a woman who had discovered that her entire marriage was built on lies. "The men who came looking for you," he said carefully, "they're not lawmen." "No." Edaline looked up at him, and he saw resignation in her grey eyes. "They're part of Thomas's old gang. They think he hid money from their jobs, money they believe belongs to them. They've been hunting us for 2 years, ever since word got out that Thomas was dead." Ruth spoke up for the first time since the poster had been revealed. "There is no money, Mr. Creed. If there ever was any, Papa spent it long before he died. We've been running from ghosts and greed, nothing more." "But they don't believe that," Sarah added. "They think Mama knows where Papa hid their share of the robberies. They've threatened—" Her voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. "They've threatened to hurt you girls if I don't tell them something I don't know," Edaline completed, steel entering her voice. "That's why we kept moving, why we never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. I couldn't risk them finding us." Harlan stood and walked to the window, looking out at his ranch, his life's work, built through honest labor and fair dealing. In a few hours, everything he'd worked for could be at risk if he chose to stand between these women and the men hunting them. Any reasonable person would advise him to help them move on quietly, to avoid bringing trouble to his door. But as he turned back to look at Edaline, he found himself remembering a pressed wildflower he'd glimpsed earlier when she'd reached into her Bible for something. The delicate bloom had been carefully preserved between the pages, yellow petals still holding a ghost of their original color. When he had asked about it, she'd said simply that Thomas had given it to her during their courtship, when she'd still believed in the man he'd pretended to be. "You've been carrying that flower for how long?" he'd asked. 15 years, she'd admitted. "I keep thinking I should throw it away, but—" She'd shrugged helplessly. "It reminds me that love can be real, even when everything else turns out to be lies." That flower, pressed between the pages of Scripture like a prayer for redemption, told him everything he needed to know about Edaline March. She was a woman who still believed in the possibility of honest love despite years of betrayal and disappointment. She deserved better than a life spent running from the sins of a dead man. "Those men will be back," he said, returning to the table. "They'll ask more questions, and they'll be less polite about it next time." "We know." Edaline stood, moving toward the back room where their few belongings waited. "That's why we need to leave tonight while we still can. I won't let you suffer for our troubles, Mr. Creed. You've done enough." "Have I?" Harlan caught her arm gently as she passed his chair. "Edaline, may I call you Edaline? You've been running for 2 years. Where exactly are you running to?" She stopped, her composure finally cracking just a little. "I don't know. Oregon was just a destination, somewhere far enough away that we might finally be safe. But I'm beginning to think there is no place far enough." "Then maybe it's time to stop running." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sarah and Ruth looked up from the table, hope and fear warring in their young faces. Edaline turned to study Harlan with those remarkable grey eyes, searching for something in his expression. "What are you saying?" she asked quietly. "I'm saying that some fights are worth having, and some stands are worth taking. You didn't choose this trouble, but that doesn't mean you have to spend the rest of your life fleeing from it. These are dangerous men, Harlan. They've killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again. I won't have your death on my conscience, and I won't have your misery on mine." He stood, his decision crystallizing with each word. "This is my land, my home. Those men have no right to come here making threats against people under my roof. If they want a fight, they'll get one." Cookie, who had been listening from his corner by the fire, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, boss, but you might want to know. Jake and the boys have been talking. We all seen those strangers, and we all got the same feeling about them. If you're thinking of making a stand, you won't be standing alone." Edaline sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the offer of protection from men who barely knew her. "I can't ask you to risk everything for us." "You're not asking," Harlan said firmly. "I'm choosing. There's a difference." For the first time since he'd known her, tears gathered in Edaline's eyes. Not tears of despair, but something deeper and more complex. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Harlan looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had brought unexpected warmth to his life, who had shown him what his empty house could become with the right person to share it. The answer was complicated, involving loneliness and attraction and the simple human need to protect what mattered, but it was also simple. "Because some things are worth fighting for," he said, "and some people are worth protecting, no matter the cost." 3 days passed in deceptive quiet. Harlan had expected Garrett and his partner to return quickly, but the silence stretched on, broken only by the routine sounds of ranch life. Jake and the ranch hands went about their duties with weapons close at hand, and Harlan found himself checking the horizon more often than usual, but no riders appeared on the snow-covered trails. It was Ruth who brought the news that changed everything. She'd been helping Cookie with the evening meal when she dropped a plate, the sound of shattering crockery sharp in the quiet kitchen. As Edaline moved to help her clean up the pieces, Ruth grabbed her mother's arm with trembling fingers. "Mama," she whispered, her young face pale with shock. "I need to tell you something about Papa, about what really happened." Edaline went very still. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "The night Papa died, the bank robbery in Topeka. Sarah and we were there. We saw it happen." Sarah, who had been reading by the fire, looked up sharply. "Ruth, no, we promised never to—" "We can't keep lying." Ruth's voice cracked with strain. "Not when Mr. Creed is risking everything for us. Not when those men are coming back." She turned to face the room, her hands shaking as she pulled a folded paper from her dress pocket. "This is why they're really hunting us. Not for money Papa might have hidden. For this." Harlan took the paper from her trembling fingers. It was another wanted poster, but this one was different. Newer, with crisp edges and clear printing. The face staring back at him from the poster made his blood turn to ice. It wasn't Thomas March. It was Edaline. Wanted for armed robbery and murder, Edaline March. Reward, $1,000, dead or alive. Below the stark text was an artist's rendering that, while not perfect, was unmistakably the woman who had been sharing his home, his meals, his growing affection for the past week. "That's impossible," Harlan said, but even as the words left his mouth, he was studying Edaline's face. She had gone very pale, but her expression wasn't surprise. It was resignation. "Tell him, Mama," Ruth pleaded. "Tell him the truth." Edaline sank into a chair by the fire, her composure finally cracking completely. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of years of carefully guarded secrets. "Thomas didn't die in that bank robbery," she said. He was shot, yes, but he survived long enough to tell the sheriff that I was the one who planned the job, that I was the leader of his gang, not just his wife. But that's not true, Sarah said quickly, moving to kneel beside her mother's chair. Mama, tell them it's not true. Edaline's silence stretched so long that Harlan began to understand the terrible truth before she spoke it aloud. It is true, she said finally. Not the way Thomas told it. I never planned anything, never led anyone. But I was there that night. I was inside the bank. The words fell into the quiet cabin like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone present. Cookie's weathered face had gone white, and Jake stood frozen in the doorway, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. I need you to understand, Edaline continued, her voice gaining strength as she finally unburdened herself of the secret she'd carried for 2 years. Thomas had been drinking heavily for months. He was angry, reckless, taking chances that were going to get him killed. I followed him that night because I was afraid he was going to do something that would destroy our family forever. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered ranch as if seeing her past written in the white landscape. I wasn't supposed to go inside the bank. I was supposed to wait with the horses, but when the shooting started, when I heard Thomas crying out in pain, I couldn't just stand there. I ran inside to help him. And Harlan's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the tension beneath the surface. I shot the bank guard. The words came out in a rush, as if she couldn't bear to hold them inside any longer. He was standing over Thomas with his gun pointed at my husband's head. He was going to execute him right there on the floor of that bank, so I shot him. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Cookie seemed to have stopped breathing as the implications of her confession settled over the room. The guard lived, Edaline added quickly. He was wounded, not killed, despite what the poster says. But Thomas, my dying husband, told the sheriff that I was the mastermind, that I'd forced him into a life of crime. He said I was the one they should really be hunting. Sarah's voice was barely audible. Why would Pippa say such a thing? Because he was afraid, Edaline said simply. Afraid of dying, afraid of being remembered as a failure and a criminal. So he made me the villain of his story. It was easier than admitting the truth, that he'd chosen a life of crime because he liked the excitement, the danger, that he'd put his family at risk for his own selfish desires. Ruth moved to stand beside her mother, her young face set with determined loyalty. The men hunting us, they're not just Papa's old gang members, they're bounty hunters. Professional killers, Sarah added quietly. Garrett and his partner make their living tracking down wanted criminals. They don't care about money Papa might have hidden. They want to collect the reward for bringing Mama in. Harlan felt the world shift around him as everything he thought he knew rearranged itself into a new and more dangerous pattern. The woman he'd been falling in love with, and he could admit that to himself now, was a wanted fugitive. The men hunting her weren't just greedy criminals seeking revenge. They were bounty hunters with a legal right to pursue her across state lines. Dead or alive, he said, reading the poster again. They prefer dead, Ruth whispered. It's easier to transport a body than a prisoner, and dead people can't testify about how they were captured. Harlan looked up from the poster to find Edaline watching him with those gray eyes that had haunted his thoughts for days. In them, he saw fear, resignation, and something that might have been hope. Now you know the truth, she said quietly. I'm not the woman you thought I was. I'm a criminal, a fugitive from justice, and those men hunting me have every legal right to take me back to Kansas, where I'll probably hang for shooting that guard. Did you plan the robbery? Harlan asked. No. Did you go there intending to hurt anyone? No. I went there trying to save my husband. And when you shot the guard, was he threatening Thomas? He was about to kill him, I'm certain of it. Harlan folded the poster carefully and set it on the table. Around the room he could feel the tension as everyone waited for his response. Cookie stood ready to follow whatever lead he gave. Jake's loyalty was absolute but practical. He'd need to know which direction that loyalty should flow. Sarah and Ruth watched him with young faces that had seen too much, hoping desperately that this sanctuary they'd found might somehow remain safe. But it was Edaline's expression that decided him. She wasn't begging for his help or trying to manipulate his feelings. She was simply waiting for his judgment with the quiet dignity that had marked every moment he'd known her. "Well," he said finally, moving toward the gun cabinet in the corner of the room, "I guess that settles it." Everyone held their breath as he unlocked the cabinet and pulled out his father's Winchester rifle. The weapon was well maintained and deadly accurate in the right hands, and Harlan's hands had proven their skill many times over the years. "Settles what?" Edaline asked, her voice barely steady. Harlan checked the rifle's action and began loading cartridges into the magazine. "Those bounty hunters want to take you back to Kansas to hang for protecting your family. I figure that makes them the criminals in this situation." He looked up at her, and for the first time since he'd known her, Edaline March smiled without reservation, a smile of pure gratitude and dawning hope. "Besides," he added, working the rifle's lever to chamber a round, "I never did like uninvited guests who come to my ranch making threats." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline winter day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Harlan stood on his porch with his father's Winchester rifle cradled in his arms, studying the approaches to his ranch with the tactical eye of a man who'd fought Indians and claimed jumpers in his younger days. The weapon felt solid and familiar in his hands. 3 generations of Creed men had carried this rifle, and it had never failed when lives depended on its accuracy. "They'll come today," Jake said, joining him on the porch with his own rifle and a grim expression. "Garrett struck me as the type who doesn't like being put off. He'll want to finish this business and move on to the next bounty." Harlan nodded, his breath steaming in the frigid air. "How many men do you think he'll bring?" "More than 2, Cookie answered from the doorway, his ancient shotgun broken open as he loaded fresh shells. "Man like that doesn't take chances when there's a $1,000 payday involved." Inside the cabin, Edaline was helping her daughters prepare for what might come. She'd found an old hunting knife among Harlan's supplies and was teaching Ruth how to hold it properly, her voice calm and instructional despite the circumstances. "If something happens to me," she was saying, "you and Sarah take the back trail up into the rocks. You know how to survive in the wilderness. I made sure of that. Find your way to the next settlement and start over with new names." "Mama, don't talk like that," Sarah protested, but her hands were steady as she checked the small pistol Harlan had given her. "Mr. Creed won't let anything happen to you." "Mr. Creed is a good man, but he's not a miracle worker," Edaline replied practically. "Those bounty hunters are professionals. They've been hunting people like us for years." Harlan heard the conversation through the open door and felt something twist in his chest. The woman who had brought such unexpected warmth to his life was preparing for capture or death with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. It wasn't right. It wasn't just. "Jake," he said quietly, "how many of the boys can we count on?" "All of them. I talked to each man individually last night. They're not happy about professional killers coming onto our range and threatening a lady." Jake's voice carried a note of pride. "Bill and Tom are positioned up in the rocks with rifles. Sam and Pete are watching the north approach. Cookie's got the cabin covered, and I'll be wherever you need me." It was a good plan, as far as plans went when facing unknown odds. But Harlan had learned in his younger days that no plan survived contact with the enemy. The key was to be ready to adapt when things inevitably went wrong. "What about Mrs. March?" Jake asked. "She going to be ready for this?" Harlan thought about the quiet strength he'd seen in Edaline over the past week. The way she'd faced the storm, the dignity with which she'd endured her revelations about her past, the calm acceptance with which she'd prepared for whatever came next. "She'll be ready," he said. "The question is whether we will be." Around mid-morning, the lookouts signaled the approach of riders from the south. Harlan counted 6 men through his spyglass. Garrett and his original partner, plus 4 additional guns for hire. Professional hunters who'd probably done this kind of work many times before. "Remember," he told his men as they took their positions, "we're not looking for a fight. We're looking to convince them that their business here isn't worth the cost. But if shooting starts, don't hesitate. These men won't show us any mercy." Edaline appeared at his elbow as the riders approached, her face pale but composed. "I should go out and talk to them," she said. "Maybe if I surrender myself willingly." "No." Harlan's voice was flat and final. "That's not how this ends." She studied his profile, seeing something in his expression that made her reach out and touch his arm. "Why are you doing this, Harlan?" "Really? I'm a fugitive from justice. By helping me, you're breaking the law yourself." He turned to look at her, this woman who had somehow become the center of his world in less than a week. The answer was complicated. It involved loneliness and attraction and the simple human recognition of kindness meeting kindness. But it was also simple. "Because I've lived 53 years building walls around myself," he said quietly. "Building this ranch, accumulating wealth, making sure I never needed anybody and nobody needed me. And in 1 week, you and your daughters showed me what those walls had cost me." Edaline's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "That's not enough reason to die." "Maybe not," Harlan agreed, "but it's reason enough to live differently than I have been." The riders had reached the gate to his property and were walking their horses slowly up the lane toward the cabin. Even at a distance, Harlan could see they were alert and ready for trouble. These weren't cowboys or local law enforcement. They had the predatory awareness of men who made their living by violence. "Mrs. March," Garrett called when they were still 50 yards away, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "We know you're in there. Time to stop running and face the consequences of your actions." Harlan stepped out onto his porch, the Winchester held casually but ready. "This is private property, gentlemen. State your business or move along." "Our business is with the wanted fugitive you're harboring, Creed." Garrett's horse danced nervously under him, sensing its rider's tension. "Hand her over, and nobody has to get hurt." "I don't see any warrants," Harlan replied calmly. "I don't see any badges. What I see is 6 armed men making threats on my land. That tends to make me unfriendly." One of the new men, a young gunfighter with quick eyes and quicker hands, laughed harshly. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, old man. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." It was Jake who answered, his voice drifting down from somewhere in the rocks above the cabin. "Counting seems to be a problem for some folks. Maybe you should count again." The bounty hunters looked around nervously as they realized they were surrounded. Bill and Tom's rifles glinted from concealed positions in the rocks, while Sam and Pete emerged from cover near the barn, their weapons ready. Cookie stepped onto the porch beside Harlan, his ancient but deadly shotgun cradled in his arms. "Like the man said," Cookie added conversationally, "this is private property, and we don't take kindly to threats against ladies." Garrett's face darkened with anger, but he was professional enough to recognize that the tactical situation had shifted against him. "This woman is wanted for armed robbery and murder, Creed. She's worth $1,000 dead or alive, and we mean to collect." "Then you'll have to go through all of us to do it," Harlan said quietly. "The question is whether she's worth dying for." For a long moment, the two groups faced each other across the snow-covered yard, weapons ready and tension crackling like electricity in the cold air. The youngest of the bounty hunters had his hand hovering near his gun, eager for action despite the odds. Garrett himself looked calculating, weighing profit against risk. It was Edaline who broke the standoff. She stepped out onto the porch beside Harlan, moving with the same quiet dignity that had marked every moment he'd known her. In her hands was something that made Garrett's eyes go wide with surprise and sudden hunger. a leather satchel, worn and weathered, but unmistakably real. "Is this what you're really after?" she called to the bounty hunters. "Thomas's share from the bank jobs, the money you think he hid from you?" Garrett leaned forward in his saddle, his greed temporarily overcoming his caution. "Where did you find it?" "It was hidden in the wagon," Edaline said calmly. "Sewn into the canvas where I never thought to look. $3,000 in gold and silver, probably more than the bounty on my head." She was lying, Harlan realized. He'd helped search that wagon thoroughly when they'd salvaged her belongings. There had been no hidden money, no secret compartment filled with stolen gold. But her deception was masterful, played with just the right mixture of resignation and bitter discovery. "Toss it over here," the young gunfighter demanded, "and maybe we'll consider letting you live long enough to stand trial." Edaline smiled then, and there was something in her expression that made Harlan's heart race with sudden understanding. She wasn't surrendering. She was buying time and positioning. "Come and take it," she said simply. The words hung in the cold air like a challenge, and Harlan knew that whatever happened next would determine not just their survival, but the kind of man he would be for the rest of his life. His finger found the trigger of his father's rifle, and he prepared to find out what he was truly made of. The young gunfighter's impatience broke first, just as Harlan had expected it would. Men like that lived on quick reflexes and quicker violence, and the tension of a standoff always proved too much for their nerves. His hand flashed toward his gun with practiced speed, but Cookie's shotgun spoke first, the thunderous roar echoing off the mountains as buckshot tore through the morning air. The gunfighter toppled from his saddle with a scream that was cut short when he hit the frozen ground. His horse reared and bolted, adding to the chaos as the other bounty hunters scattered, seeking cover behind trees and rocks while their own weapons came into play. "Sarah, Ruth, get down!" Edaline shouted, pushing her daughters toward the cabin's interior as bullets began to fly. But she didn't follow them to safety. Instead, she moved to the corner of the porch where Harlan's spare rifle leaned against the wall, her movements quick and sure. Harlan's Winchester cracked twice in rapid succession, and one of the bounty hunters staggered and fell, clutching a shattered shoulder. From the rocks above, Jake's rifle added its voice to the growing battle, forcing Garrett to abandon his position near the gate and scramble for cover behind the well. "You should have taken the deal, Creed," Garrett shouted over the gunfire. "Now we'll take the woman and burn your ranch for good measure." "You're welcome to try," Harlan called back, working the lever of his rifle as another bullet splintered the porch rail beside his head. He could see two more bounty hunters moving to flank the cabin from the east, using the barn for cover. That was when Edaline surprised him. Instead of the frightened woman he might have expected, she handled the spare rifle with competent familiarity, settling into a shooting position with movements that spoke of experience. Her first shot took one of the flanking men in the leg, sending him sprawling behind a water trough. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Harlan asked during a brief lull in the firing. "Thomas insisted I learn," she replied, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. "He said a woman in his line of work needed to be able to protect herself." Her voice carried bitter irony. "The one useful thing he ever taught me." From inside the cabin came the sound of breaking glass as a bullet found the kitchen window. Sarah's voice rose in a sharp cry of alarm, followed immediately by Ruth's steady reassurance. The twins were holding up well, but Harlan knew the situation was far from resolved. They'd drawn blood, but Garrett still had 4 men capable of fighting, and professional bounty hunters didn't give up easily when a $1,000 payday was at stake. The next phase of the battle came when 2 of the surviving hunters tried to rush the cabin from different directions, hoping to overwhelm the defenders with coordinated aggression. It was a good tactic, but they hadn't counted on the crossfire from Harlan's positioned ranch hands. Bill's rifle spoke from the rocks, and one of the charging men went down hard, rolling through the snow and coming to rest against a fence post. The other made it almost to the porch before Edaline's steady aim found him, her bullet taking him center mass and dropping him like a stone. "That's 4 down," Jake called from his position. "How many more you figure they got?" Before Harlan could answer, Garrett's voice rose above the sound of the wind. "Enough! This is over, Creed. Send the woman out, or we burn the cabin with all of you inside." To emphasize his threat, one of the remaining bounty hunters tossed a lit torch toward the cabin's wooden walls. The flames caught immediately in the dry timber, and orange light began to lick up the side of the building. It was then that Edaline did something that took Harlan's breath away. She reached into her dress and pulled out her silver locket, the tarnished, heart-shaped pendant that had caught his attention on the first day he'd met her. For a moment, he thought she was going to keep it as a final memento of better times. Instead, she opened the clasp and placed it gently in his palm. "In case something happens," she said quietly. "I want you to have this. It belonged to my mother, and her mother before her. It's the only thing of value I own that wasn't touched by Thomas's crimes." Harlan felt the weight of the small silver heart in his hand, warm from her body heat and smooth from generations of loving touch. Inside, he glimpsed two small photographs, one of a young couple on their wedding day, faces bright with hope and innocence, and another of two little girls with familiar eyes. "Edaline," he began, but she was already moving, her rifle in her hands and determination in her gray eyes. "I'm going out there," she announced. "I'm going to end this before your home burns down around us." "Like hell you are," Harlan replied, reaching for her arm. But Edaline March had made up her mind, and when she set her jaw in that particular way, Harlan was beginning to understand that very little could deter her. She stepped off the porch and into the open yard, her rifle held ready but not immediately threatening. "Garrett," she called. "You want me? Here I am. Let's finish this between us and leave these good people out of it." Garrett emerged from behind the well, his gun drawn but pointed toward the ground, in a gesture that might have been respect or might have been calculation. His remaining partner, a grizzled man with scars across his cheek, kept his rifle trained on Edaline from his position near the barn. "Smart woman," Garrett said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Should have done this from the start. Saved everyone a lot of trouble." "The trouble started the day you decided to hunt an innocent family," Edaline replied, her own weapon held steady. "But it ends today." From his position on the porch, Harlan felt ice settle in his stomach. He could see what Edaline was planning, a final confrontation that would settle things one way or another, but he also understood that she was prepared to die to protect him and his men, to end the threat that her presence had brought to his ranch. "You shot a bank guard," Garrett continued, taking a step closer. "Man still walking with a limp because of you. That's attempted murder in Kansas, and attempted murder carries the rope." "He was going to execute my husband in cold blood," Edaline said calmly. "I did what any wife would do." "What any outlaw's wife would do," Garrett corrected. "The difference matters to the law." Behind Garrett, his scarred partner was shifting position, trying to get a cleaner angle on Edaline. Harlan saw the movement and tensed, his father's Winchester coming up to his shoulder. But before he could fire, a new voice cut through the cold air. "That's far enough, mister." Jake had worked his way down from the rocks and now stood behind the scarred man, his rifle pressed against the bounty hunter's spine. The tactical situation had shifted again, but Harlan knew it wouldn't matter if Garrett decided to take his shot at Edaline. "Interesting situation we have here," Garrett mused, apparently untroubled by his partner's capture. "Question is, who's faster, me or you, Mrs. March?" "I guess we'll find out," Edaline replied. It was then that Harlan noticed something glinting in the snow near Garrett's feet. At first, he thought it was just ice catching the sunlight, but as his eyes focused, he realized what he was seeing. A charred family photograph, partially buried in the snow that had been scattered during the gunfight. The image was damaged, but still recognizable. A family portrait showing a younger Garrett with a woman and two children. Understanding hit Harlan like a physical blow. This wasn't just about the bounty money. It was personal. "You knew Thomas March?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "This isn't about justice. It's about revenge. Garrett's composure cracked for just a moment, his eyes flicking toward the photograph before returning to Edaline. Thomas March killed my family during a bank job in Colorado. Shot my wife and children when they got in his way during the escape. That's impossible, Edaline said, but Harlan could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Thomas never... He said he never hurt innocents. Thomas March said a lot of things, Garrett spat. Most of them lies. Just like everything else about your marriage was a lie. The revelation hung in the cold air between them, another layer of tragedy in an already complex situation. Harlan found himself looking at Edaline with new understanding, not just a woman fleeing her husband's crimes, but someone who was still discovering the full extent of the damage those crimes had caused. Even if that's true, she said quietly, killing me won't bring your family back. No, Garrett agreed, but it'll balance the scales. His hand twitched toward his gun, but he never got the chance to draw. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made everyone freeze as a new group of riders appeared on the horizon. Sheriff Bradley led a posse of 6 men, all armed and riding hard toward the ranch. "Stand down!" Bradley shouted as they approached. "Everyone lower your weapons!" Garrett's face went through a series of expressions: frustration, calculation, and finally resignation. He was professional enough to recognize that the situation had changed beyond his ability to control. With a curse, he holstered his gun and raised his hands. "This is a legal bounty hunt, Sheriff," he called. "We have warrants." "Maybe so," Bradley replied, dismounting with his own gun drawn. "But you don't have jurisdiction in Montana. Territory. If Mrs. March is to be arrested, it'll be done proper-like, with legal process and a fair hearing." Jake prodded the scarred bounty hunter forward with his rifle, adding him to the growing collection of prisoners. Around the yard, the other members of Garrett's gang lay dead or wounded, their threat ended by superior tactics and determination. "Are you all right?" Harlan asked, moving quickly to Edaline's side. She was trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline of combat giving way to delayed shock. "I think so," she managed, leaning against him for support. "But Harlan, what he said about Thomas, about other people being hurt, we'll sort it out," he promised, wrapping his arms around her. "All of it. Together." Sheriff Bradley approached them, his expression grim but fair. "Mrs. March, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. There are questions that need answering and proper legal channels to follow." Edaline nodded, having expected as much. But before she could respond, Harlan stepped forward. "She's not going anywhere alone," he said firmly. "If you're taking her, you're taking me too." 3 months later, the Montana spring had arrived, with all the gentle promise that made men forget the brutality of winter. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks, leaving behind valleys green with new grass and streams running full with snow melt. Harlan stood on his porch, watching the sun set behind the Bitterroot Mountains, a cup of coffee warming his hands and contentment warming his heart. The legal proceedings had taken most of the winter, but justice had eventually prevailed in the way it sometimes did when good people refused to let bureaucracy overwhelm common sense. Sheriff Bradley had testified on Edaline's behalf, describing the circumstances of her husband's death and the years she'd spent fleeing professional killers. The bank guard from Topeka had been located and interviewed, admitting under oath that he'd been about to execute Thomas March when Edaline shot him in defense of her husband. More importantly, the judge in Helena had been a fair man who understood the difference between criminal intent and desperate circumstances. Edaline had been sentenced to time served and community service, with the understanding that she would remain in Montana territory, where local authorities could keep an eye on her. It was as close to vindication as the law allowed, and more than any of them had dared hope for. "The biscuits are almost ready." Edaline's voice came from the kitchen, carrying the same gentle warmth that had transformed his house into a home. She appeared in the doorway, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the gray in her eyes. her hair pinned back in a style that was both practical and beautiful. "Smells like heaven," Harlan replied, and he wasn't just talking about the biscuits. Every evening for the past month had brought the same pleasant routine: supper. Together, quiet conversation, the comfortable domesticity that came from two people who had found their place in each other's lives. Sarah and Ruth had taken to ranch life with the enthusiasm of young women who had finally found a place to call home. Sarah had shown a natural aptitude for working with horses, while Ruth had discovered a talent for keeping the ranch's books that rivaled any accountant in the territory. They'd grown from frightened refugees into confident young women with bright futures ahead of them. "Girls," Edaline called, "come help me set the table." As the twins bustled around the kitchen, preparing for the evening meal, Harlan reflected on how much his life had changed since that blizzard night when he'd ridden out to rescue strangers. The lonely millionaire cattleman who had sat in this same chair 6 months ago seemed like a different man entirely, one who had built walls around his heart and called it wisdom. After supper, when the dishes were cleaned and the twins had settled into their evening routines, Harlan and Edaline took their usual walk around the ranch. It had become their favorite time of day, when they could talk quietly about their plans and dreams, their hopes for the future they were building together. "Jake thinks we should expand the horse operation," Harlan mentioned as they paused by the corral, where a mare nuzzled her new foal. "Says there's good money in breeding quality animals for the cavalry." "It sounds like a sensible idea," Edaline replied, her hand finding his in the gathering twilight. The girls would love to be more involved with the horses. They walked on in comfortable silence, past the barn where Cookie was giving instructions to the evening shift, past the bunkhouse where the ranch hands were settling in for the night. Everything was peaceful, prosperous, and exactly as it should be. When they returned to the cabin, Edaline disappeared into the bedroom for a moment and returned carrying something wrapped in brown paper. She handed it to Harlan with a smile that was both shy and pleased. "What's this?" he asked, accepting the package with curious fingers. "Something I've been working on. A wedding present, you might say." Harlan unwrapped the paper carefully and found himself holding a quilt unlike any he'd ever seen. It was made from fabric cut from his own old shirts, pieces of Edaline's dresses, and cloth that Sarah and Ruth had contributed from their few belongings. The pattern was simple but elegant, and every stitch spoke of love and care and the patient work of creating something beautiful from fragments of different lives. "It's our story," Edaline explained softly. "All of us sewn together into something new, something that couldn't exist without every piece." Harlan ran his weathered fingers over the quilt, feeling the different textures and recognizing fabric from shirts he'd worn during cattle drives, from the dress Edaline had been wearing the night he'd rescued her from the storm. It was more than a blanket. It was a testament to the family they'd become, the love they'd found in the most unlikely circumstances. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The wedding had been a simple affair, held in the cabin with Sheriff Bradley officiating and the entire ranch crew in attendance. Cookie had prepared a feast that would be talked about for years, and even the neighboring ranchers had come to celebrate the union that had transformed the most confirmed bachelor in the territory into a devoted family man. Now, as they prepared for bed under the quilt that told their story in thread and fabric, Harlan marveled at the strange turns life could take. He'd spent 25 years building a successful ranch, accumulating wealth and respect, but he'd been building it for no one but himself. Now, suddenly, everything he'd worked for had purpose beyond mere accumulation. "Do you ever regret it?" Edaline asked as they settled under the covers. "Taking in 3 strangers who brought nothing but trouble to your door?" Harlan pulled her close, breathing in the scent of lavender that always seemed to cling to her hair. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. It was the sound of home, of peace, of a life lived with purpose and shared with people who mattered. "Never," he said firmly. Sometimes the heart waits a lifetime to find its home. I'm just grateful mine finally did. In the morning, there would be cattle to tend and horses to train, books to balance and futures to plan. But tonight, under a quilt that told the story of their unlikely love, Harlan Creed fell asleep knowing that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with youth and dreams, but with wisdom and the courage to open your heart to unexpected possibilities. The end.